And now joining us for the program is Tony Gosling, historian and investigative journalist, joining us out of Bristol, and Bruce Katz, co-president at Palestinian and Jewish Unity, joining us out of Montreal. Gentlemen, I'd like to welcome you both to the program here. I guess we'll start there in Bristol with you, Tony. Good evening to you. I hope you're safe and doing well. Now, a permanent ceasefire, Tony, and withdrawal from Gaza, and everything goes away. The conflict goes away. You get your captives back. There are no more tensions and cross-border exchanges along the southern Lebanese border if you're Israel. But no, you choose to continue the genocide, not accept a ceasefire, and basically put your captives in danger, put your IOF forces there in Gaza in danger. And also, now you're picking off senior Hezbollah commanders, really pushing for a bigger confrontation for Hezbollah. Help us understand Tel Aviv's narrative in all of this, what it is after.
Well, I remember on an internet forum I ran through with the UK's 9/11 Truth campaign back in the noughties. We had a fascinating thread which was called Inside the Heads of the Elitist Psychos. And this is the idea of trying to understand what motivates the warmongers, what motivated the US-Israeli push for those 9/11 attacks, which is pretty clear now. Anybody that looks into 9/11 and the whole idea of the war on terror was perpetrated by both by the United States and Israel together, mainly for the benefit of the Israelis, actually. But the point is, if you go back to the 1970s, you will find a former CIA officer, Philip Agee, wrote a book called The Warfare State. And the idea of the warfare state is very simple. It's actually your whole economy is based around and predicated on expansion. That is, taking over new natural resources. And I'm afraid that's what the I suppose you could call Crusader state for the Anglo-Zionist Empire is doing in Israel. So it has to expand. And in order to do that, it has to be taking new land. Now, this T-shirt of mine here I'm wearing today is to celebrate Gerard Winstanley. He's a famous Brit from the English Civil War who was the pioneer of land rights. So he said land must be everybody, and it should be yours as a total right. He was the one of many people say the originator of communism. So, would you believe? But the point is that you must have equality, and with everyone has land, then you have basic equality. People can walk away from a job if they don't like it. But the point I'm trying to make here is that this is a struggle for land, actually really a massive, audacious real estate grab and resource grab that the Israelis are doing here, which is necessitated by the way that the West has to grab more and more resources in order to keep this dying economy going. And so that's what I think is inside these people's heads. They know they've got to grab and steal land in war in order to keep themselves going. But in the background, of course, there's also this massive religious conflict they're trying to provoke. They're doing their very best, these modern crusaders.
Thank you, Tony and Mr. Bruce Katz. Welcome to the conversation out of Montreal. Hope you're safe and doing well, Bruce. Now, Israel said it's going to eliminate initially Hamas in Gaza, Bruce, and it proceeded for 9 months plus, proving that it cannot. So tell us your initial thoughts on why it is pursuing a bigger, greater conflict now with Hezbollah.
Well, look, Israeli generals have stated outright that Israel does not have the capacity to defeat both Hamas and Hezbollah, despite the fact that they've massacred more than 37,000 Palestinian civilians, and in effect, it's much more than that. There are at least 20,000 missing. So we're talking about something like closer to 60,000 deaths, 100,000 injured, yet they continue in a struggle that they can't win. Basically, I think Israeli protesters have hit the nail on the head when they say that this is continuing because Netanyahu doesn't want to fall from power. He faces trial for bribery, fraud, breach of trust, which could put him in prison in Israel. So it's in his interest to continue a war, which puts him in power, and by the very fact that Israel cannot defeat Hamas and Hezbollah, in order to stay in power, Netanyahu has to expand the war. And this is a last-ditch attempt on his part to provoke a wider regional war in the hope of bringing the United States in which might very well touch off, would have all the potential to touch off a world war. What we see in the presence of a Netanyahu is the pathological behavior of a sociopath whose only interest is in Benjamin Netanyahu. And I've said this before in previous interviews at Press TV, that human life has no value for this man. He's a psycho. And when I say human life, I mean the lives of Israelis as well, who I think perhaps are only finally realizing that they are victims, not to the extent that Palestinians are, but they are victims also of this man's pathological behavior and a pathological group of right-wing extremists who make up his coalition government. So if people think that he's going to support the idea of a ceasefire, unfortunately they're sorely mistaken, because even Israeli journalists have said that he's done everything he can to scuttle the possibility of a ceasefire for the reasons that I just invoked.
Right, and they put that to Tony. Tony, why is that? I mean, the fact that it's not just Mr. Bruce Katz, but there are people within Israel, even within the government apparatus, that feel Netanyahu is out of control, him and his cabinet, that he is a psychopath. A lot of the Western allies, also Western leaders, pretty much have alluded to the fact that they either are behind a hot mic or behind the scenes. You get little snippets that it seems like that's kind of a consensus that the man is a madman. So why aren't there more effort? Why isn't there more effort at de-escalation, especially with Hezbollah and especially a greater conflict involving Lebanon? I mean, the efforts at de-escalation by Western leaders have been lukewarm at best, Tony.
Look, I think many people do think of Netanyahu as a madman, but that doesn't help solve the situation. I think we need to point out the basic fundamental flaws in his ability to lead his country. And yes, he's disconnected from the real world, but we need to point those facts out. As the Israeli Defense Force have been doing, for example, saying you can't fight on two fronts in Gaza and in Lebanon at the same time, so you're going to have a ceasefire in Gaza. And he's refusing to do that. That was reported last week. But also, his main war aim, one of the two, along with releasing the hostages, is the elimination of Hamas. And we hear today that only 25% of Gaza is controlled by the Israeli Defense Force, that Hamas controls 75% of Gaza still. So he's completely failed to do that. And I think it was today one of the Israeli, it's the Israeli Defense Force, is saying that Hamas will still be in Gaza in 5 years' time. So he has totally failed in one of his two fundamental war aims. The other one, to release the hostages, clearly he's failed. And actually, the longer this goes on, the more of those hostages he is killing. And so, yeah, I mean, you could call it madness. I would just say, let's hold Netanyahu's feet to the fire, as many of, even in the Israeli Defense Force, are doing. Obviously, many of his own citizens can see that his war aims, he is completely failing in those aims, and that somehow he needs to be pushed aside so that someone else can take over, who has a bit of stronger grip on reality. And let's face it, most of surrounding countries, such as Lebanon and Syria, are led and populated by people who actually come from this part of the world. The Israeli government is a settler colonial government. They're basically imposters. They're imposters from another part of the world, mostly from Europe, who have come to that place in order to take over back in the Second World War in 1947 and to implement their new state. And so I think I personally would trust the people that know the culture. First of all, they know the Jewish, the Islamic, and the Christian faiths very well. It's almost in their blood. They know the idea of love thy neighbor, something that the Israelis seem to have completely forgotten, and also how to carry your people with you as a leader, which Netanyahu is incredibly, totally failed to do.
All right, we have very little time left, but I really want to get this last question out to you, Mr. Bruce Katz. How does the war in Lebanon and with Hezbollah benefit Israel and the U.S., Mr. Katz? I mean, Tony mentioned that this could be all part of a real estate grab, possibly trying to occupy Gaza, possibly parts of Lebanon even. I mean, maybe Tel Aviv's that bold to be looking that far ahead. And that kind of takes us back to those normalization deals we saw with a handful of countries under the Abraham Accords, under the tenure of Donald Trump, that it gives validity. That kind of move gets justification and validity to it. I mean, in Tel Aviv's eyes, to its occupation, that for it to start looking beyond what it's so far occupied to see what else it could occupy.
Basically, I think that we need to remember that even Israeli journalists and even a couple of Israeli military personnel pointed out the fact that Netanyahu was aware at least a year ahead of the attack on October the 7th. He was informed that such an attack was being planned. I do not believe for a moment that he was not aware of it. I am of the opinion that he meant to use it all along to unleash the type of genocidal attack that they have unleashed on Gaza, with the idea of evincing the Palestinian population out of Gaza and achieving what extreme right Zionism has wished to achieve from its outset, which was to establish the greater Israel, meaning pushing the Palestinians out of all of the historical Palestine and replacing it with an exclusive Jewish state in the West Bank, Jerusalem, and Gaza, which the Israelis have the notion of calling Judea, Samaria, and Gaza as if they were still living in biblical times. This is fallacious. It's not likely to happen, but what may very well happen if Netanyahu has his way is to continue to launch attacks in Lebanon, in Syria, and perhaps even in Iraq at some point, with the hope of causing a regional war and drawing the United States into it, because the object, the target for Israel is Iran. Let's be clear on that. And they know very well they can't attack Iran. Iran is too powerful, and the hope for Netanyahu is draw the United States into a larger war and stay in power and stay out of Israeli prison.
Thank you both for joining us in the program. Time has gotten the better of us. Stay safe to both of you. Tony Gosling there, historian and investigative journalist, joining us from Bristol, and Mr. Bruce Katz, co-president at Palestinian and Jewish Unity, joining us out of Montreal. And viewers, this brings us to the conclusion of this segment of your Press TV News Review program. Thank you for tuning in, and bye-bye for now.
Thank you.